Imagine your nation's ships seized, your citizens sold into slavery, your flag openly defied by predatory states demanding protection money. For the young United States, this wasn't imagination. It was the humiliating reality posed by the Barbary pirates. How did a country founded on liberty respond to such blatant extortion? Welcome to Old Around the World, where we travel back in time to bring historical events back to life. Long before the cataclysmic internal conflict of the Civil War would tear the American nation asunder, long before the clarion call of manifest destiny would propel its citizens across a vast and often unforgiving continent, a young, fledgling, and internationally vulnerable United States of America faced its first significant, protracted foreign threat, its first baptism by fire in the unforgiving crucible of overseas war. This formidable enemy was not one of the established, traditional European empires with their disciplined armies and grand navies, but rather a shadowy, decentralized yet highly effective network of ruthless sea raiders and predatory Barbary states, operating with impunity from the sun-scorched shores of North Africa. These corsairs, for centuries, had held European and now American sailors captive in deplorable conditions, demanding crippling, humiliating ransoms, and in doing so, brazenly challenged the very sovereignty and nascent international standing of the new American Republic on the vital high seas. Many Americans, even today, are familiar with the stirring, iconic line from the United States Marine hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. But what is the incredible, often overlooked, and historically vital true story that lies behind those resonant and famous words? This is the sprawling, dramatic saga of the Barbary Wars, a decades-long, intermittent yet persistent struggle that compelled a young nation, still grappling with its own identity and internal challenges, to confront the brutal, centuries-old realities of international piracy. It was a conflict that forced it to make the painful, politically divisive decision to build a credible navy virtually from scratch, to assert its fundamental right to free and unmolested trade in distant waters, and to grapple with the complex, morally fraught, and deeply practical questions of tribute, ransom, national honor, and the justifiable use of force in a hostile and often anarchic world. It was, in essence, America's first sustained, significant encounter with foreign powers beyond its own immediate shores, a veritable baptism by fire for its nascent foreign policy, its emerging military institutions, and its evolving national identity. For centuries, stretching back to the medieval period and beyond, the southern and western littoral of the Mediterranean Sea, an expanse of coastline infamously known as the Barbary Coast, was home to a formidable and widely feared maritime power. From the bustling, heavily fortified, and semi-autonomous city-states of Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and what is now modern-day Libya, and the independent, though often cooperating, Empire of Morocco, Barbary corsairs. Sea raiders often operating with the explicit sanction, if not direct command, of their local rulers, beys, deys, or pashas, preyed relentlessly upon the vital shipping lanes of the Mediterranean and, with increasing audacity, into the broader Atlantic. These were not simply disorganized, rogue pirates acting solely on their own accord for personal gain, as might be popularly imagined. This was a highly sophisticated, deeply entrenched, and often brutally effective system of state-sponsored raiding, extortion, and human trafficking that had terrorized Mediterranean and even North Atlantic commerce for generations, shaping the foreign policies and draining the treasuries of numerous European kingdoms. Their operational business model was as brutally effective as it was morally repugnant. Merchant ships hailing from nations that had not meticulously secured peace through formal treaties and the regular, substantial payment of pre-negotiated sums were considered legitimate, fair game. Unprotected vessels were swiftly and often violently seized by the fast, well-armed Barbary xebecs and galleys. Their valuable cargo, ranging from grain and timber to manufactured goods and luxury items, was plundered. Their crews and any passengers aboard were captured and subjected to a grim fate. These unfortunate souls, often numbering in the thousands across Europe over the centuries, were frequently enslaved, forced into grueling hard labor under harsh conditions, rowing in galleys, toiling in quarries, or constructing fortifications. Others were held in wretched, disease-ridden prisons while their respective governments or desperate families frantically sought to raise the exorbitant ransoms demanded for their release. To avoid this horrific fate, most European maritime powers, including the great naval powers like Great Britain, France, Spain, and even smaller states like Sweden and Denmark had, over time, resigned themselves to engaging in a humiliating but often perceived as pragmatic practice. They paid substantial annual tribute, effectively protection money, bribes, or diplomatic gifts to the various Barbary rulers. This system, though costly and galling to national pride, generally ensured, at least temporarily, the safe passage of their merchant fleets through Barbary-controlled waters. It was, in essence, a centuries-old, highly organized protection racket, writ large on an international scale, a recognized, if deeply resented, cost of doing business in the Mediterranean world. For the newly independent United States of America, barely a nation in its own right, this deeply entrenched Barbary system posed an immediate, dire, and existentially challenging threat. Prior to the American Revolution, colonial American shipping, while subject to British mercantile regulations, had largely sailed under the formidable protection of the British Royal Navy and, by extension, under the umbrella of the substantial British tribute payments made to the Barbary states. But with the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and its formal recognition by the Treaty of Paris in 1783, American merchant ships were suddenly, and perilously, on their own. They were stripped of British naval protection, no longer covered by British treaties, and now flew the flag of a new, militarily weak, and largely unrecognized nation, making them particularly inviting targets for the corsairs. Compounding this acute vulnerability, the young American Republic, deeply wary of the potential for tyranny inherent in standing armies and powerful navies after its long and arduous struggle against British imperial power, had, in a fit of post-war austerity and ideological conviction, almost entirely disbanded its continental navy at the end of the Revolutionary War. It possessed no significant standing naval force capable of defending its burgeoning maritime commerce in distant waters. It did not take long for the opportunistic Barbary corsairs to identify and target this new, unprotected prey. The first American merchant ships fell victim to Algerian pirates in the mid-1780s, shortly after the end of the Revolution. The stories that slowly, agonizingly trickled back to the United States painted a grim and deeply distressing picture. The capture of vessels like the merchant ship Maria of Boston and the brig Dauphin of Philadelphia, their crews subjected to harsh enslavement, paraded through the streets of Algiers, and forced into brutal labor under the whips of their captors. The American government, still operating under the weak Articles of Confederation, seemed powerless to intervene effectively. Early, often frustrating, diplomatic efforts by figures like Thomas Jefferson, then serving as the American minister to France, and John Adams, his counterpart as minister to Great Britain, to negotiate treaties and secure the release of the growing number of American prisoners were fraught with immense difficulty, cultural misunderstandings, and profound humiliation. They found themselves confronting deeply entrenched systems of extortion, rulers who viewed them with contempt, and a diplomatic landscape where force and financial tribute were the primary currencies. Jefferson and Adams, though both fiercely determined to secure American interests and uphold national honor, often clashed vehemently on the best approach to this vexing problem. Adams, the pragmatic New Englander, initially leaned, with considerable distaste, towards the established European model of paying tribute as the lesser of two evils, believing it to be cheaper and more expedient in the short term than attempting to build a navy and wage a distant war. Jefferson, the idealistic Virginian, even then, argued passionately and consistently for a more forceful, principled response. He advocated for the creation of an international coalition of smaller maritime nations to confront the Barbary powers collectively and, crucially, for the United States to build its own naval force capable of compelling respect through strength rather than purchasing it through bribery. Back in the United States, the heart-wrenching plight of the captured American sailors, whose letters detailing their suffering were sometimes published in American newspapers, and the continued, economically damaging threat to vital maritime trade, ignited a fierce and often passionate national debate. Should the young nation, still financially fragile from the Revolutionary War, deeply indebted, and ideologically wary of foreign entanglements as famously cautioned by President Washington in his farewell address, swallow its burgeoning national pride and pay the humiliating tribute demanded by the Barbary rulers? This was, for some influential voices, the pragmatic, realistic path, seemingly less costly in the immediate term than the immense, long-term financial and political commitment required to build, maintain, and deploy a credible navy capable of projecting American power across the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean. Or should America, a nation explicitly founded on lofty principles of liberty, self-determination, and independence, categorically refuse to submit to such blatant extortion and instead invest its limited resources in a naval force designed to defend its citizens, protect its commerce, and uphold its national honor, even if such a course meant risking a costly, dangerous, and potentially unwinnable war against seasoned adversaries in their home waters? Thomas Jefferson, among other prominent figures like Gouverneur Morris, was a strong, consistent, and eloquent advocate for the latter, more assertive course. He fervently believed that paying tribute was not only a stain on national honor, but also a strategically flawed policy that would only invite ever-increasing demands and perpetuate American vulnerability in the long run. After years of often acrimonious debate in Congress, mounting public frustration over the continued enslavement of American citizens, and the demonstrable failure of purely diplomatic overtures, the federal government finally took decisive, if initially hesitant, action with the passage of the Naval Act of 1794. This landmark piece of legislation, born of necessity, authorized the construction of 6 powerful, well-armed frigates, the USS Constitution, President, United States, Constellation, Congress, and Chesapeake. Ships that would form the very foundation and enduring core of the modern United States Navy. However, the act contained a crucial, and as it turned out, ultimately problematic, compromise provision. Construction on these vital warships would be halted if a peace treaty could be successfully negotiated with Algiers, then considered the most powerful and aggressive of the Barbary states. And indeed, in 1795, after protracted, complex, and often deeply frustrating negotiations, the United States, under President Washington, concluded a treaty with the Dey of Algiers. The price of this peace was exceptionally steep and deeply humiliating for many Americans, a substantial upfront payment amounting to nearly $1 million, a significant portion of the federal budget at the time. The costly delivery of naval stores including a newly constructed 36-gun frigate, the Crescent, to the Dey, and, most gallingly, an agreement for ongoing annual tribute payments. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but for many in the government, it seemed a necessary, if deeply distasteful, step to secure the immediate release of over 100 American captives who had languished in Algerian prisons for years, and to gain at least a temporary cessation of Algerian attacks on American shipping. As a direct consequence of this treaty, and in accordance with the 1794 Naval Act, construction on 3 of the 6 new frigates was temporarily, and controversially, suspended, a decision that many naval advocates, including future presidents, would soon come to regret. The respite provided by the treaty with Algiers, however, was characteristically short-lived, and a new, unrelated maritime threat soon emerged much closer to American shores. The quasi-war with France, an undeclared naval conflict fought primarily in the Caribbean and along the American coast from 1798 to 1800, erupted over French seizures of American merchant ships during the Napoleonic Wars. This conflict, though not directly related to the ongoing Barbary issue, ironically spurred the completion and active deployment of the remaining U.S. frigates whose construction had been authorized in 1794. The quasi-war provided the fledgling U.S. Navy and its young officers with invaluable combat experience, tested its new warships, and powerfully demonstrated to a previously skeptical Congress and public the absolute necessity of a standing, professional naval force to protect American commercial interests and national sovereignty in an increasingly dangerous world. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson, the longtime advocate for a more forceful and principled approach to the Barbary Menace, and a man who had chafed under the humiliation of paying tribute during his time as a diplomat, became the 3rd President of the United States. His ascent to the nation's highest office signaled the potential, and for many, a long overdue, shift in American policy towards the Barbary states. The era of reluctant, costly, and dishonorable tribute was drawing to a close, and the stage was being meticulously set for America's first declared war on distant, foreign shores. The specific catalyst for open, declared conflict came shortly after Thomas Jefferson assumed the presidency. Yusuf Karamanli, the ambitious, aggressive, and often mercurial Pasha of Tripoli, felt that his relatively small state was not receiving its fair share of American tribute payments when compared to the larger sums being paid to the more powerful rulers of Algiers and Tunis. In May 1801, After his increasingly strident demands for a hefty, immediate increase in these payments were firmly rebuffed by the new Jefferson administration, which was ideologically opposed to the entire system of tribute, Caramanli contemptuously declared war on the United States. He did so in the traditional, symbolic Barbary fashion, by ordering his soldiers to chop down the flagpole bearing the American stars and stripes at the United States consulate in Tripoli. Jefferson, philosophically committed to ending the payment of tribute and now, as president, armed with a small but increasingly capable and congressionally supported navy, decided that the time for appeasement was over. It was time to respond to this blatant act of aggression with decisive force. Even before Tripoli's formal declaration of war, Jefferson, anticipating trouble, had already dispatched a small squadron of American warships to the Mediterranean with orders to protect U.S. shipping and to chastise any Barbary power that dared to attack American vessels. This initial naval force was commanded by Commodore Richard Dale, who was soon succeeded by Commodore Richard Morris. Both of these early commanders struggled significantly with the immense logistical challenges of maintaining a fleet so far from American shores, with the complexities of navigating unfamiliar waters and local political intrigues, and with somewhat restrictive rules of engagement. The tide, however, began to turn decisively with the arrival in the Mediterranean in 1803 of Commodore Edward Preble, a demanding, highly disciplined, often irascible, but exceptionally effective naval officer. Preble would energize the American war effort, instill a new level of professionalism in his young officers, who became known as Preble's Boys, many of whom would later distinguish themselves in the War of 1812 and aggressively take the fight to the enemy. The early stages of the Tripolitan War were nonetheless marked by considerable frustration and one major disaster for the Americans. The attempts to impose a tight naval blockade on Tripoli's well-defended harbor proved difficult to maintain with the limited number of ships available and were often porous, allowing some Tripolitan corsairs to slip out and continue their depredations. Then, in October 1803, a severe blow fell upon the American squadron. The frigate USS Philadelphia, one of America's finest and newest warships, commanded by Captain William Bainbridge, ran hard aground on an uncharted reef near Tripoli harbor while aggressively pursuing a small Tripolitan vessel. Despite desperate efforts to free her, the Philadelphia was stuck fast. Captain Bainbridge and his entire crew of over 300 men were subsequently captured by Tripolitan gunboats as the tide went out, leaving their ship vulnerable. They were paraded through Tripoli and imprisoned under harsh conditions. The Philadelphia itself, a powerful 36-gun frigate, was refloated by the Tripolitans at high tide, brought triumphantly into Tripoli harbor, and anchored under the guns of the Pasha's castle. A formidable prize that the enemy could potentially repair, rearm, and turn against the remaining American forces. The capture of the USS Philadelphia was a profound humiliation for the United States, a severe blow to American morale, and a significant loss of naval strength in the Mediterranean. But this very disaster also set the stage for one of the most audacious, daring, and subsequently celebrated exploits in the entire history of the United States Navy. In February 1804, a young, exceptionally brave lieutenant named Stephen Decatur, Jr., one of Preble's boys, volunteered to lead a perilous, almost suicidal, nighttime raid to destroy the captured Philadelphia before the Tripolitans could make her seaworthy again. Under the overall command of Commodore Preble, Decatur and a small, hand-picked band of about 75 volunteers sailed directly into the heavily defended, moonlit Tripoli harbor aboard a captured Tripolitan ketch, a small two-masted sailing vessel, which had been renamed the USS Intrepid. To further the deception, the Intrepid was disguised to look like a local Maltese merchant vessel seeking refuge from a supposed storm, with most of its American crew hidden below decks. Under the very muzzles of the Pasha's powerful castle cannons and the surrounding harbor fortifications, Decatur skillfully maneuvered the Intrepid alongside the anchored Philadelphia. The Americans then swarmed aboard, overwhelmed the surprised Tripolitan guards in fierce, desperate hand-to-hand combat, involving cutlasses and pistols, and quickly proceeded to set the American frigate ablaze in multiple locations, ensuring her complete destruction. With the Philadelphia now a raging inferno, Decatur and his men made a miraculous, daring escape from the harbor under extremely heavy cannon and musket fire from the aroused Tripolitan defenses, miraculously suffering only one man slightly wounded. News of Decatur's incredible feat of bravery and skill electrified the American public back home, significantly boosted naval morale, and earned unstinting praise even from America's former adversary and the world's preeminent naval power, Great Britain. The renowned British Admiral Horatio Nelson himself reportedly called Decatur's raid the most bold and daring act of the age. Inspired by Decatur's spectacular success and the blow it dealt to Tripoli in confidence, Commodore Preble intensified his attacks on Tripoli throughout the long, hot summer of 1804. He launched a series of bold and relentless bombardments against the city's formidable fortifications and the Pasha's fleet of gunboats anchored in the harbor. These fierce naval engagements, while not decisively ending the war on their own, inflicted considerable damage on Tripolitan defenses, further demonstrated American naval prowess and determination, and steadily increased the pressure on the defiant Pasha Yusuf Karamanli. Meanwhile, an even more unconventional, almost fantastical, military operation was unfolding on the North African landmass. William Eaton, a former U.S. Army captain, a somewhat eccentric and highly ambitious figure who had previously served as American consul to Tunis, had long advocated for a land-based offensive against Tripoli. He convinced a somewhat skeptical President Jefferson to support a daring, high-risk plan to overthrow Yusuf Karamanli and install his exiled, more compliant older brother, Hamid Karamanli, as the rightful Pasha of Tripoli. In early 1805, Eaton, accompanied by a small but highly symbolic contingent of 8 United States Marines led by First Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon, and a much larger, incredibly diverse, and often unruly force of several hundred Arab, Greek, and other European mercenaries loyal to Hamid, embarked on an almost unbelievable and exceptionally grueling 500-mile march across the unforgiving, sun-scorched Libyan desert, starting from Alexandria in Egypt and heading westward towards the strategically important Tripoli and port city of Derna. After many weeks of unimaginable hardship, including near starvation, thirst, internal disputes among the fractious mercenary force, and the constant threat of attack from hostile desert tribes, this improbable army, a motley collection of adventurers and soldiers of fortune, finally reached the outskirts of Derna. Supported by the gunfire of American warships under Captain Isaac Hull positioned offshore, Eaton and O'Bannon's forces, with the Marines leading the charge, launched a desperate assault on the city's defenses on April 27, 1805. After fierce fighting, they captured Derna. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable, victory against considerable odds. This action marked the very first time the American flag had been raised in triumph on foreign soil in the Old World, and it is this hard-won battle, and O'Bannon's heroic leadership of the Marines, that is specifically and enduringly immortalized in the famous opening line of the United States Marine hymn, From the Halls of Montezuma to the Shores of Tripoli. The unexpected fall of Derna, combined with the ongoing, relentless naval pressure from Preble's, and later Commodore Barron's and Rogers' squadron, and the very real threat of further internal revolt stirred by the American-backed Hamid Karamanli, finally convinced the increasingly isolated Yusuf Karamanli to negotiate an end to the war. In June 1805, a treaty of peace was signed between the United States and Tripoli. Under its terms, Tripoli agreed to end all hostilities against American shipping and formally renounced any future demands for tribute from the United States. However, in a concession that angered many Americans at the time, particularly William Eaton, who felt his hard-fought victory at Derna had been strategically undermined, the United States did agree to pay a sum of $60,000 as ransom for the release of the remaining officers and crew of the captured USS Philadelphia. Nevertheless, the First Barbary War had largely, and significantly, achieved its primary strategic objective. The cycle of American tribute payments to Tripoli was definitively broken. While the treaty with Tripoli in 1805 brought a measure of hard-won peace with one of the Barbary states, persistent problems with the others, particularly the powerful and historically aggressive Dey of Algiers, as well as Tunis, continued to simmer and occasionally flare up. American merchant ships still faced sporadic harassment, and the underlying system of tribute, though challenged, had not been entirely dismantled across the entire Barbary coast. However, the United States soon found itself embroiled in a far larger, more existentially threatening conflict much closer to home, the War of 1812 against Great Britain. For nearly 3 grueling years, from 1812 to early 1815, the still young U.S. Navy was fully and desperately occupied battling the formidable British fleet in the Atlantic, along the American coast, and on the Great Lakes. This necessary preoccupation left American Mediterranean commerce once again highly vulnerable to any opportunistic aggressors. The Barbary pirates, ever watchful for signs of weakness or distraction among the Christian maritime powers, predictably sensed an opportunity and renewed their depredations against American shipping. In 1812, while America was preoccupied with its all-consuming war against Great Britain, the Dey of Algiers, Haji Ali, feeling that U.S. tribute payments, stipulated in the earlier 1795 treaty, were in arrears and perceiving that American naval power was significantly diminished and fully engaged elsewhere, effectively declared war on the United States. Algerine corsairs once again began capturing American vessels and enslaving their crews. For the duration of the War of 1812, the United States, fighting for its very survival against the British, could do little to respond effectively to this renewed Barbary aggression in the distant Mediterranean. But once peace with Great Britain was finally concluded with the Treaty of Ghent in early 1815, President James Madison, now commanding a significantly larger, far more experienced, and battle-hardened U.S. Navy, which had acquitted itself honorably against the world's premier naval power, was firmly determined to settle the Barbary issue decisively, once and for all. In May 1815, with the War of 1812 concluded, the United States Congress swiftly authorized naval action against Algiers. Two powerful American squadrons were promptly dispatched to the Mediterranean. The first of these, commanded by none other than the celebrated hero of the First Barbary War, Commodore Stephen Decatur, arrived in the Mediterranean with remarkable speed and struck with characteristic decisiveness. Within days of entering the Mediterranean Sea, Decatur's flagship, the USS Guerriere, ironically, a captured British frigate, engaged and captured the Algerine flagship, the frigate Mashuda, killing the renowned Algerine Admiral Rice Hamida in the process. Shortly thereafter, another Algerine brig was also captured by Decatur's squadron. With these swift and demoralizing naval victories, and with the bulk of his effective naval power either captured or neutralized, Decatur sailed his formidable squadron directly into the heavily fortified harbor of Algiers itself. Under the menacing guns of his American warships, he coolly dictated peace terms to the stunned and humbled Dey of Algiers, Omar Aga. The resulting treaty, signed aboard the USS Guerriere in June 1815, was a complete and unambiguous American triumph. Algiers agreed to release all American prisoners immediately and without any ransom, to pay substantial reparations for seized American property, to formally end all demands for any future tribute payments from the United States, and to grant the United States full and unmolested shipping rights in perpetuity. Decatur then sailed his victorious squadron to Tunis and Tripoli, both of which had also renewed hostile acts against American shipping during the War of 1812, and quickly, with similar displays of naval force and diplomatic resolve, forced them to sign comparable treaties renouncing tribute and respecting American commerce. The long and humiliating era of American tribute payments to any of the Barbary states was definitively and finally over. The Barbary Wars, spanning nearly 2 decades of intermittent yet consequential conflict, involving humiliating tribute payments, complex diplomatic maneuvering, daring naval engagements, and even a remarkable land expedition, were far more than just a colorful or romanticized series of clashes with exotic pirates. They were, in fact, a crucial, formative, and often defining period for the young, still maturing United States, leaving an indelible and lasting mark on its nascent military institutions, its evolving foreign policy doctrines, and its emerging sense of national identity on the world stage. The decisive American victories in the Second Barbary War in 1815, particularly Decatur's triumph over Algiers, brought a definitive and widely celebrated end to the humiliating and costly practice of paying tribute to the North African states. This was a powerful, unambiguous assertion of American sovereignty, national honor, and its determined refusal to be subjected to international extortion by any foreign power, however distant or intimidating. These protracted conflicts were absolutely foundational in the very establishment, early development, and professionalization of both the United States Navy and the United States Marine Corps. The pressing necessity of combating the Barbary corsairs had directly spurred the initial, often politically contested, construction of America's first generation of powerful frigates, ships like the legendary USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, which would go on to earn further glory in the War of 1812. The Barbary Wars provided these fledgling American naval and marine services with invaluable, hard-won combat experience in distant waters, forging a cadre of skilled, courageous, and strategically adept officers, figures like Edward Preble, Stephen Decatur, William Bainbridge, Isaac Hull, and Presley O'Bannon, who would become national heroes and inspire future generations. These conflicts instilled a deep tradition of professionalism, discipline, and valor within the American sea services. The United States Marine Corps, in particular, cherishes its significant and defining role in the Barbary Wars, a role forever immortalized in the evocative opening lines of the Marines' hymn and visibly symbolized by the Mameluke sword still proudly carried by its officers today. A pattern based on the ornate sword presented to Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon by Hammet Caramanley in recognition of his heroic leadership at the Battle of Derna. Beyond their undeniable military and institutional significance, the Barbary Wars played a vital, if often underappreciated, role in shaping the contours of early American foreign policy. They powerfully demonstrated the nation's burgeoning willingness, even in its relative infancy and while facing considerable internal challenges, to employ military force, when deemed necessary, to protect its vital commercial interests, the lives of its citizens, and its national honor abroad. These conflicts set important early precedents for how the United States would subsequently deal with foreign threats, project its nascent power across vast distances, and assert its rights as an independent, sovereign nation on the often treacherous and competitive world stage. The successful defiance of the long-established Barbary powers contributed significantly to a growing sense of American national identity, a burgeoning pride in its own capabilities, and a nascent belief in the nation's capacity and destiny to act decisively and effectively in international affairs. While the American victories, particularly in 1815, represented a significant blow to the traditional Barbary system of tribute and piracy, the ultimate and complete decline of Barbary piracy as a major force in the Mediterranean was a more protracted and complex process. It involved continued, often uncoordinated, pressure and periodic military actions by various European powers throughout the 19th century, culminating in major events such as the Anglo-Dutch bombardment of Algiers in 1816 and, most decisively, the eventual French conquest and colonization of Algeria beginning in 1830. Nevertheless, the American Barbary Wars were a crucial, pioneering early challenge to the perceived impunity with which these North African states had operated for centuries, signaling forcefully that a new, determined power in the West would not idly or indefinitely submit to their depredations and demands. Some historians and political commentators have, over the years, occasionally drawn parallels, however imperfect, between America's early struggle against the Barbary pirates and later, more contemporary challenges involving state-sponsored terrorism, the rise of so-called rogue states, or the broader imperative to protect international norms and freedom of navigation. While historical analogies must always be approached with caution and nuance, the Barbary Wars do offer enduring lessons about the complexities of dealing with non-traditional, asymmetric threats, the delicate and often difficult balance between diplomacy and the application of force, and the long-term, persistent challenges of ensuring freedom of the seas and promoting international security in a constantly evolving global landscape. The Barbary Wars, therefore, were America's first sustained, declared military engagements on foreign soil and across distant and unfamiliar seas. They constituted a crucial, often perilous, and ultimately defining test for a young republic still earnestly finding its place, its voice, and its footing in a frequently hostile and predatory world. From the early, deeply humiliating years of coerced tribute payments and the agonizing enslavement of its citizens, the United States, through remarkable perseverance, unwavering political will, often against considerable domestic opposition, and the undeniable courage and skill of its sailors and marines, moved steadily, if sometimes haltingly, to a position of demonstrable strength. It ultimately succeeded in decisively defeating the Barbary states in direct naval confrontation and compelling them, through a combination of force and diplomacy, to respect American sovereignty and commerce. These largely forgotten wars, often relegated to the footnotes of broader historical narratives, were, in fact, profoundly foundational. They were undeniably instrumental in establishing America's permanent naval power, a force that would prove essential for its future security and global influence. They played a critical role in shaping its early foreign policy identity, moving it away from pure isolationism towards a more assertive defense of its interests abroad. And they broadcasted a clear, unambiguous message to the wider world. The United States of America would not bow to extortion, nor would it indefinitely tolerate assaults on its citizens or its commerce. The defiant cry, "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," which had echoed with patriotic fervor during earlier diplomatic crises with European powers, became more than just a spirited, popular slogan. It became, through the trials of the Barbary Coast, a national policy forged in the fires of conflict, a guiding principle that would continue to resonate, in various forms, throughout the long and complex tapestry of American history. The hard-won lessons learned on the distant and treacherous shores of Tripoli were indeed instrumental in shaping the nation that was, and the far more powerful and influential nation that was destined to come. If you like this, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. Bye, history lover.